And I'd like to issue an apology on behalf of my colleague, Andy Miles, who's not able to be here today. But some of his words are in this presentation, but also he's the principal investigator of the project, so it was his idea and his colleague's idea. So I want to make that clear at the beginning. The plan for this session is I'll talk for about 25 minutes. We'll have then a short film about Kuta for 8 to 10 minutes. And for the rest of the time, if possible, I'd like us to discuss the film and the usefulness of the visual method. What I've done, probably wrongly for Methods at Manchester, is to really sketch in the context of the research, because I think that's quite important. Well, as you can see, there's a slide of a kind of statue of Rob Roy. Why is that colour? Why is that colour up there? It's not on like that on the slide. Anyway, that's Rob Roy. It's a statue outside Kuta, the place where we did research, and it's a kind of mascot of the village. And at one point in its history, it featured on teletext as it got lost, and or it wasn't going to be put back up on the hill, and so people were very upset about that because it is the village mascot, as it were. What is Understanding Everyday Participation? It's a large AHRC-funded research project and is part of the Connected Communities programme. This project proposes a radical re-evaluation of the relationship between cultural participation and cultural value, asking profound questions about the meaning of culture, participation and value, in part through empirical inquiry about people's day-to-day activities. For example, what they do, where they do it, how and with whom, in the process considering the value attached to such activities. Between 2013 and 2017, UEP has undertaken focused fieldwork, supplementing national level quantitative and historical research which commenced in 2012 in 6 main case study areas in England and Scotland: Manchester, Salford, Aberdeen, Gateshead, Dartmoor, Stornoway and Peterborough, the last 2 still to do, as well as secondarily through related PhD projects in Barnsley and Glasgow. Our aim is to paint a broader picture of how people make their lives and relate to each other through culture. We want to challenge the idea that some forms of culture and cultural institutions have more worth than others, an idea that reinforces inequalities and sets up particular boundaries. We're particularly interested in the interplay between place, locality and participation, which is often overlooked in official statistics and by policy making from the centre. To this end, we're very much in agreement with Raymond Williams when he suggested in his book, Culture is Ordinary. I'm just going to read a little bit. Culture is ordinary, that's where we must start. To grow up in that country, he's talking about a bus ride from Hereford to his home on the Welsh border, was to see the shape of a culture and its modes of change. I could stand on the mountains and look north to the farms and the cathedral, or south to the smoke and the flare of the blast furnace, making a second sunset. To grow up in that family was to see the shaping of minds, the learning of new skills, the shifting of relationships, the emergence of different language and ideas. My grandfather, a big hard labourer, wept when he spoke finely and excitedly at the parish meeting of being turned out of his cottage. My father, not long before he died, spoke quietly and happily of when he'd started a trade union branch and a Labour Party group in the village, and without bitterness of the kept men of the new politics. I speak a different idiom, but I think of these same things. And he contrasted that with the culture of his time at Cambridge University. Williams perhaps provides one of the lenses through which we develop our ideas on method, the idea of working with others to find out about the ordinary mundane cultures of a particular place and community, and how those produce meanings and values which are, as Williams puts it, in solution, forever fluid, depending on the dominant residual and emergent molecules of that structure of feeling. Which methods, for instance, may help us to make sense of a local culture, which at the same time, especially here, interweaves with the global scales of the oil and gas industry, coping with the comings and goings of globally mobile workers and incorporating those mobilities into its everyday cultures. The context of our work is Aberdeen in northeast Scotland. Sometime oil or energy capital of Europe, oil being an important theme of our work, particularly so given the current local suffering in the face of a considerable decrease in the price of oil and therefore many redundancies. Our field work has taken place in Peter Kuta, known as Kuta. With a population of 4,500, it lies 8 miles west of the city. Historically administered by both shire and city at different times, this has led to its somewhat contested status as part of Aberdeen city. This conflicted identity has led the Kuta Community Council, with a nod to both city and shire, to badge it in their literature as the village in the city. Kuta lies on the very western limit of the city, betwixt and between country and city, a semi-rural settlement on the road north up to the Highlands. Creative Scotland, our funders, were interested in its status as an edge community and a city on the edge, not Edinburgh or Glasgow or even the touristic west coast. Kuta lies on the edge of the city, the country, the Highland region, and even Scotland itself. It even has its own dialect. It's an Aberdeen phenomenon, not Gaelic but Doric, almost a language all of its own, spoken in the everyday in Aberdeen and the country round and about. Kuta's economy has been heavily dependent on the oil since the closure of Kuta paper mill in 1981, an industry operating in the village since 1751. Similar in form to a gold rush, the oil has brought some of its long-time residents unforeseen wealth, whilst others working in care, retail or other service industries, which don't have a direct oil and gas link, have struggled to survive in a high-cost economy. Oil has brought a particular kind of wealth to Aberdeen and surrounding areas, one not often seen to contribute to the common weal. Chakraborty, in 2014 in The Guardian, compared and contrasted the wealth creation and consequent distribution of North Sea oil and gas exploration wealth with that of Norway, whilst Oslo in 1974 laid down the principle that oil wealth should be used to develop a qualitatively better society through the Government Pension Fund of Norway. The UK government used it to, amongst other things, cut taxes for the wealthy. There is no such fund in the UK as far as I'm aware. Norway's fund is now worth more than 100,000 for each man, woman and child in that country, and the Norwegian state owns 70% of the oil companies and fields. UEP's methodology involves 5 sequenced and interrelated work packages. I'm just telling you this, but we're only concerned really with one today. So first of all, critical historical examination of themes around participation, reanalysis of secondary data around participation and time use, case studies of participation, that's what I've been involved in. 4 application projects designed to test research knowledge on the ground. And finally, a package which will link research, policy and practice. Jennifer Mason, in arguing for a mixed method, qualitatively driven approach, has written that social experience and lived realities are multidimensional and that our understandings are impoverished and may be inadequate if we view these phenomena only along a single dimension. With this in mind, we've worked with different methods in Aberdeen and Kuta to build up a picture of participation and consequent community formation, connectivity and capacity, in the process connecting historical, geographical and economic contexts, and analysis of participative cultures with the sociological research questions with which we begin our research. However, as we've only recently finished this work, my account today will be partially formed and still in the making, and so still subject to change and rewrite. Work in North East Scotland began with a series of scoping exercises, allowing a familiarisation with both the macro and micro geography of the places with which we would become so intimately involved for the next 18 months. Meetings with key stakeholders both in Aberdeen and Peter Kuta were initiated in efforts to get the research started. Ethnography was not the only method of gathering information and participating about participation in Kuta, so we also understood a significant programme of interviewing, both formally and informally. And as the project was nearing completion, we produced a short film about Kuta, that's the title, intended to extend the co-production of research within the village and encourage a wider engagement with potential audiences for our research more generally. We ended our time there through participation in the AHRC Connected Communities Festival in June 2015 with postcards from Kuta a project that aimed to interrogate the place of Kuta through a photographic dialogue, consequent exhibition of photographs and postcards, and a series of photographic workshops. The thrilling conclusion to both that and the project as a whole was our ending event held on Midsummer Day 2015, at which we had a full to capacity, standing room only attendance at Kuta Village Hall. Although the programme of digital mapping, interviews, ethnography, film production and photographic projects seemed like discrete methods in the same location, they were symbiotic. Without the initial scoping and careful interactions in Kuta, little that followed would have been as successful. Each method entailed its own dynamic, which then provided impetus through another series of contacts for further work on understanding what participation, or not, means in Kuta, to whom, how, where and why. So we began with the recruitment of 30 people with whom to conduct two-hour qualitative interviews. 5 months later, we began our formal ethnography in 3 village settings, though this evolved into what turned out to be a whole village ethnography. These 2 methods were perhaps our primary means of understanding Kuta, though digital mapping of village and city resources such as libraries, formal arts venues and the social club has been an alternative means of interpreting participation, place and value. Film and photography followed later, in the later stages of our work. The ethnography was what... Can you just tell me what time we're on? It's okay. Okay. The ethnography was one of the primary reasons I was employed on this project. Although the formal time of ethnographic work was May and June of 2015, on reflection, as noted earlier, I feel to a large extent the whole experience was an ethnographic one. Penny Harvey proposes ethnography as a qualitative method that aims to open up and extend understandings of how human beings live in the world. She suggests that a more participative ethnographic method of navigating a world both unfamiliar and on the move is more useful than the more traditional mode of awaiting discovery and description. Since this project involves researching everyday participation, Harvey's outline of a seemingly more democratic and participative mode of inquiry seemed a useful one to bear in mind. The decision over where to do the ethnography was one that required careful thought. The ethnographic settings in which we were to work had to be part of a shared village space, ones in which different constituencies participated. After considering various options, we decided on 3 venues in which ethnographic work would be focused: the Village Hall, the Mill Social Club and Kippy Lodge, a more upmarket sports and country club just beyond the Kuta boundary. The ethnography, however, was about more than only working in the chosen settings. I made the decision as soon as I got to the village in early summer, and I lived there for 2 months during the summer of 2014, that I would become part of life in Kuta in a more general sense. This entailed attending as many events as possible and generally getting to know more about what people did, who, with, where and when. On reflection, I realised that I changed the way in which I organised my own time. My temporalities became that of Kuta's and of the settings in which I worked. The days were spent at the Village Hall or Kippy Lodge, with the spaces in between taken up with formal or informal interviews. The evenings were spent at Kuta Mills Social Club or at any event being held in the village. There was a kind of enchantment for me in the routines of the places and people with whom I had contact and had built relationships. I had to experience life in Kuta in the round. I rarely ventured outside the village during those 2 months, since there were always regular meetings with various people and groups. On a Sunday evening, for instance, I became part of a bingo table at Kuta Mills Sports and Social Club. Going out on a Sunday, therefore, became difficult. I felt committed to the practice of playing bingo and knew that, should I miss a session during my 2 months extended stay, I would let my bingo partners down. They wanted to get to know me and vice versa. It would be an affront to their hospitality in welcoming me to their table if I was an intermittent attender. Kuta for 2 months became the centre of my world. I kept bumping into the same people wherever I went. It became a joke that wherever people went, they would see me. Thus began the banter about my becoming a permanent resident of the village. The first ethnographic setting in which we decided to work was the village hall. At the centre of the village and open virtually from dawn to dusk, it seemed an essential hub, one that a cross-section of village residents visited. One of the interesting things about the mother and toddlers group in which I worked for 2 days a week for those 2 months, though obviously over the whole 15 months I was to visit them many times. But the interesting thing was the way in which we could connect the micro relationships and interrelations between the people at the mother and toddler group in the village hall with the macro of the oil industry and the way in which the oil industry organised social relations and gendered life for people. So most of the time it's men working in the oil, maybe travelling abroad for long periods of time. And for the women who were left behind, the village hall became like an extended family for some of them. The second place that the second setting in which I did my ethnographic work was the Cooter Mill Sports and Social Club. I paid regular visits here both on a casual evening basis and as a glass collector during special events. I tried to do some work wherever I did the ethnographic work so that I wasn't just standing around. I wanted to be part of what everyone was doing. The club tends towards an older clientele, many of them having worked at Cooter Paper Mill, the reason historically for the club's existence. There's a bowling green, snooker tables, and until relatively recently a tennis court, the land on which it stood having to be sold for much needed cash. I became especially friendly with the women on a particular Sunday evening bingo table, Miriam, Anne, Carol and Sophia. They kept an eye on me. I genuinely couldn't keep up with the numbers, and Anne on at least one occasion had to shout house for me because I'd missed the numbers. Anne is 90. I also made friends with a small informal social group of men aged 50 plus who meet a few times after work to share a joke and a pint with a nip or two. It seemed within the group 2 kinds of temporality and even spatiality coexisted. For those in the group who'd worked at the paper mill, their temporalities seemed still adjusted to that of working in the same place at the same time, not too far away from home. Hence the club, ostensibly after work. However, most of them work or have worked in the oil as globally mobile workers and do or have spent months at a time away from home doing dirty and dangerous work. The social club acted as a kind of anchor in the turbulence of globalisation. Finally was Kippy Lodge. That was the third setting for my ethnography, which was a sports and country club. And it was set in the big old house up the hill, and everyone in the village thought it was very posh, even though it wasn't necessarily very posh. But it had been set up by the oil industry and still called the Aberdeen Petroleum Club. But it's not owned, as far as I'm aware, by the oil industry now. It's owned by the members. I spent a great deal of time in there in the hair and beauty section, doing small interviews with people having their nails painted or their hair done. And the staff at Kippy were fantastic, and the woman on reception there just facilitated so many moments in which I could do interviews or meet people. So I had such a degree of cooperation from everyone. But here we learnt a great deal again about the oil industry, how it worked, how it affects families who had to move to Kuala Lumpur, Houston or Stavanger at a moment's notice. Only relatively recently did I hear the term trailing spouses, can you believe that? For the non-working, mostly oil wives who has to up sticks and move with their husbands at the say-so of whichever oil company they worked for. We had some very interesting discussions about private versus state education too. How much time is it now? 5 minutes, right. So for the last 5 minutes, I'm going to just switch very quickly. Sorry about the abruptness of it. But what I'd like to do, we decided about 6 months before we were due to finish in Cooter that we would make a film. So that, because we'd built up such a network of relationships, in a sense it was relatively easy to do the film and to have people cooperate with us. I it was a film that wasn't challenging, I don't think, for the people involved in it, but it was a co-production in some ways. It was a co-production about the village, or one story of the village. But alongside that, what we did was to enter a bid for the AHRC festival in summer 2015, and we put together a photographic project which involved people taking disposable cameras around the village and taking pictures of things they liked and didn't like. It involved photographic workshops. It involved translating photos into postcards and making a big exhibition at the village hall. So I'm just going to show you some slides. Postcards from Kuta. There you can see our programme. Postcards from Kuta. This is one of the workshops with people who used to work at the paper mill in the village, talking about the paper mill as we walked around the site of where the mill used to be, now occupied by flats. Putting up the postcards exhibition in the village hall. We had a reminiscence and photo sharing afternoon at the Heritage Centre. This gives some idea of the centrality of the paper mill in the history of Kuta. So that it sounded 5 times a day. The hooter in the village sounded 5 times a day. The first one at 5 o'clock in the morning, and only when people probably involved in the oil industry came to work in Kuta because it was a nice rural place did it stop, because they asked for the hooter to stop at 5 o'clock in the morning. People were asked to choose from the archive, some photos from the archive, which they did. Interestingly, this was one of the photos that came out of the disposable cameras, where people were asked to take photos of what they liked, and I really like this one. The caption for this photo reads, "We love our neighbour's shed." So Liz's kitchen was 1 floor up, and she could look over and see the movements of her neighbours through looking at the shed. It sounds banal, but I quite like that. We also did some workshops with the Kuta Primary School After School Club, where we did photograms, which were brilliant to do because they're easy and quick. A workshop led by one of the villagers entitled Secret Places of Kuta. People decided they would lead workshops. And on the next day we went for a Kuta landscapes photo walk. And we had a derive, a situationist walk, which was brilliant, which was the kind, does everybody know what that is? Where you, instead of just going for a walk, you take it in turns to decide which way you should go and what you should look at and what to talk about. It was really interesting. It was very good. Such was the involvement of people in the village that one of the young women who we got to know asked to do a workshop. And we wanted to concentrate more on postcards from a future Kuta, because we wanted to talk more about the future rather than the past. I'm not saying that we entirely got to grips with it, but it was a very interesting workshop. So here's the exhibition. We made a little art book called Postcards from Kuta that's going to be sold in aid of the Heritage Trust. And this was one of the photos. People sent in photos via a website to put up in the exhibition. And several people within the community chose photographs to be printed as postcards, again to be sold in aid of village causes. So this is one of the photos, Kuta in the Mist. And this is our ending event.